Okay. Hi everyone. My name is Jurica Cular. I'm coming from Information System Security Bureau. This is the last talk of the day, at least in this room. So I'll try to keep it short to get ahead of schedule. I'll be talking about NIS Directive. If you were the part of the round table, there was a question about it, and I believe half of the room raised their hand if they ever heard of this directive. It's a legal issue, but it has a bunch of technical elements inside, and I will try to keep it on a technical level. So a year ago, August 2016, EU Commission, after 2 or 3 years of preparation, finally announced NIS Directive, which is kind of first EU cybersecurity strategy. We talked today about GDPR, and we have to make a distinction between directive and regulation. A lot of people confuse those points, and it's very important to distinguish them. So GDPR is a regulation that was established by European Commission. It was translated to all the, let's say, member state languages, and all countries, member states, need to adopt that regulation. So member state has no effect on changing this regulation, it just has to adopt it. Directive is something different. EU Commission or the European Union gives you the framework or the guidelines on how to establish your legal framework, and it's up to member state to develop it. This allows state to, let's say, bend or interpret the rules from the directive from their point of view, but directive is, if you read it, it is really concrete, and it specifies all the important things that the country needs to do. Okay, so NIS Directive is Network Information Security Directive. It's actually called the new EU Cybersecurity Strategy, and on a federation level globally, this is the first strategy on such big scope. United States or Asian federations don't have such unique strategy. This is why the EU, from this point of view, is supposed to be ahead of the rest of the world, but we'll see how this works. Directive will be mandatory for all EU states, but will not be mandatory for all the companies. So small enterprises are excused from applying to this directive. And what's actually in the focus of the directive is the critical infrastructure or essential services, as they call this term in the directive. Critical infrastructure has been a buzzword for like 10 years, and it has become buzzword in cyber world for similar period of time. Why do we care about that? The problem are vulnerabilities. So you can all recognize the phone on the picture. It was created in this century. It's created in a way that you are allowed to update this device in case vulnerabilities are discovered. And this is all automatic process. But what do we do with things like this? These were developed like 50 years ago. They were not intended to be connected to internet, not to be used remotely, but business requires today to operate these facilities over the internet. And how do you patch vulnerabilities on these things? One big problem when we talk about critical infrastructure and critical information infrastructure is the confusion. Critical infrastructure is very often regarded as a part of critical infrastructure, as one sector. So this is the image people usually think of critical information infrastructure, but the situation is actually more like this. So you can find critical information infrastructure in every sector of critical infrastructure. This is not just one part. In almost, not almost, but in 100%, every sector you will be able to find something that is critical from information point of view. So what is the scope of the directive? Directive requires member states to identify two types of entities. One of those are operators of essential services or critical infrastructure, and the other one are digital service providers. As you can imagine, the first group is much more important. So what does the directive say? What is operator of essential services? This entity needs to supply services essential for maintaining critical social and economic activities. This service needs to depend on the ICT, and any cyber incident would significantly impact service delivery. We will see later about digital service providers, but for the DSPs, directive didn't exclusively say who they actually are. They just said they should be recognized within these sectors. So there are 7 sectors of operators of, this is the wrong name. So there are 7 sectors: energetics, transportation, banking, financial markets, infrastructure, health, water supply, and digital infrastructure. So as you can see, these are really broad terms, and you couldn't recognize who actually these entities are just from seeing this list. So the crucial problem for the starters will be how to identify what's actually critical. My organization, ISSB, started this process like 2 years ago when we adopted the strategy. And at this moment, Croatia has 11 sectors of critical infrastructure compared to 7 sectors of operators of essential services from the directives. Mapping is fully possible, so all our sectors could be mapped to this directive. What is required from us at this first stage is create the list of the companies, entities who will be operators of essential services. So how do we plan to do this? This is the methodology we developed 2 years ago, which we plan to use in identifying critical information infrastructure. As you can see, we are using 2 sets of criteria. One is national criteria and one is sectoral criteria. National criteria are applied to all, possible to apply for every sector, and sectoral criteria are specific just for one sector. We decided to use this way because if we used only national criteria, we would not granulate these services enough. And the last criteria is, of course, that the service that will be recognized as critical needs to use IT to be recognized as critical information infrastructure. So actually we developed the methodology 2 years ago when we haven't seen the directive yet, and directive actually fully complies with this methodology. All the criteria we decided to use are mentioned within the directive. What are the expectations from directive? What do we actually need to do? Member states, I'm talking from the perspective of the government, we need to establish sectoral authorities. For each sector, you need to say, this organization is let's say, in charge, is your regulator, is your sectoral authority. You need to have a single point of contact, which will inform European Commission in case there is an incident or in case Croatia changes anything regarding the laws. Member state is required to have the cyber strategy. At this point, this is the only thing we have checked. And very important part, especially for my organization, is that for each sector, our new law needs to say This is the third organization that is in charge of dealing incidents with your sector. Special part of the directive is, let's say, talking about incident reporting. Main focus is to exchange information between member states. So directive says that incidents need to be reported without delay, and it's expected to do so in 24 to 72 hours. Second part, after we identify the operators of essential services, our new legislation needs to create concrete requirements what these operators need to do. So it will not be enough just to say, okay, you need to comply with ISO 27 or any other standard. You will have to, we will have to develop the new list of requirements that will be obligatory for all the operators of essential services. Directive is not very clear on this part. So it very often uses the terminology state of the art. So it is expected from the organization that will be obligatory for NIS directive to use state of the art technology. If you read Croatian translation, it's not very good, but I believe you all know what state of the art means. And of course, like every standard, all the measures need to be guided by risk assessment. Other important parts that will be actually a major change in, I would say, our cybersecurity landscape, that our new legislation imposes audit. So government will be allowed to perform audit on all operators of essential service. They can have internal, they can have external audit, like banking system has at the moment, but government will be asked to perform audit on a regular basis. Of course, when you have audit, you have the penalties. This is also mandatory from the directive point of view, and they are required to be efficient, proportional, and deterring. These amounts of 10 million euros or 2% of annual revenue are just recommendations. So this is the part we can, let's say, bend the rules and have these amounts lower. Important thing about the penalty is that if you are breached, if you are a victim of a cyber attack, it's not directive's purpose to penalize situation when you became a victim. What will be penalized is the situation in which you have been breached and you had no chance to recognize that something happened on your network. So if something happened and you didn't have that state-of-the-art equipment organization, in that case, you will be penalized. So these are some important dates. As I said, the directive was enforced a year ago. In February this year, two groups from the NIS directive started working. This is a cooperation group that is working on, let's say, strategic level, helping countries create new legislation. And the CSERT network is a group of national and government certs from every member states who are preparing to create new tools, ways, methodologies to exchange information. Very important date is May 9th. This is the day when Croatia needs to inform European Commission about our new legislation, and the next day, May 10th, this new legislation needs to come in force. From our perspective, let's say, institution that is a part of pen holders in creating new legislation, this deadline is even 4 months shorter, because Croatian government adopted new, let's say, law decision that any directive that comes from EU needs to be prepared 4 months before it actually comes into place. So after May 9th, we need to have this ready, and we have a period of 6 months to identify who are our critical operators. We don't need to prepare a list of actual companies. We just need to report on what are the essential services for Croatian society. In 2018, European Commission will start controlling how the governments, member states prepare their legislations. And this is not actually official yet, but let's say that the plan of the European Union from 2020 beyond is to broaden this scope. So if this goes fine, it's very likely that these new measures, security measures, will be broadened to not only operators of essential services, but not sure what kind of institution, but the scope will actually be much broader. So this is it in short. We have like 6 months to, less than 6 months to prepare the new legislation. This will create a lot of work for government institutions, but due to measurements that these operators will need to follow, I believe this will create, let's say, economy for many consulting, cyber consulting companies in Croatia. So in short, this is it. If you have any questions, I'm here to answer.
Hello. If I may ask, is that state-of-the-art equipment going to appear out of thin air or from the EU, or how?
No. It will appear from your budget. Yeah.
Hi, Jurica.
Hi.
What will be the time for adoption?
Time for adoption. Yeah. We have some space to, again, bend the rules a bit. So it is required to follow the new measurements once your institution, 6 months after your institution is identified as operator of essential services. But it will be allowed to, let's say, create steps. Let's say, to do it in 3 phases. You need to comply with this during first 6 months, you need to comply with this during first year, and let's say you need to comply with this during the first 2 years. So it's up to member state to decide it, but it will definitely not be allowed to have terms like 10 years or something like that. There will be some grace period.
As I read this directive, it's stated in some annex there that telcos are exempt from this procedure because they are regulated by some directive from 1997 or something.
Yeah, they are. As you saw, they are not on the list of these services. But again, important part will be during this identification process. You need to take into account the, let's say, cascading effect of critical infrastructure. If energy sector, for example, is out, all of the sectors will be out. And I think this applies to your sector as well. So, as I said, the law is not ready yet. We are talking to all interested parties, but we do not have the final solution yet. Thanks.